Now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Martin Cherry, our librarian at the Museum of Freemasonry. And Martin will be giving us a talk about Frederick Monroe and some very insightful letters indeed. And Martin, we're very excited to hear more. I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Hi. This paper is mainly about Prince Hall Freemasonry, which grew from one lodge, African Lodge number 459 in Boston, Massachusetts, which was formed by Black Freemasons in 1787, who applied to the Grand Lodge of England for a warrant or charter to meet after they were turned down by the newly formed Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. It grew to become what is now the largest fraternal organisation for Black men in the United States. It's named after Prince Hall, who was the first master of African Lodge, and whose writings and actions inspired those that followed to form lodges and eventually Grand Lodges in his name. At the beginning of the 20th century, which is the time period covered by my talk, mainstream Grand Lodges in the United States, and by that I mean those that had a predominantly white membership, did not recognise Prince Hall Freemasonry, which meant none of their members could visit Prince Hall lodges, and Prince Hall Freemasons could not visit theirs. In fact, many lodges around the world at the time, including the United Grand Lodge of England, considered Prince Hall Freemasonry clandestine or irregular. Happily, things have changed, but that was still the situation on the 28th of December 1901, when Henry Sadler, the Grand Tyler and Sub-Librarian of the United Grand Lodge of England, wrote a letter to Frederick S. Monroe, the corresponding secretary of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. Over the next 6 years, the pair would be in regular correspondence, and Monroe's letters are preserved in the archive collection of the Museum of Freemasonry. Monroe's letters hinted a warm friendship between the two men and are full of his insights into a number of issues. Over the course of this talk, I'm going to tell you about what Monroe's thoughts were on some of these issues, including two authors who are writing very different histories of Prince Hall Freemasonry, the prejudice faced by African-American Freemasons, and the preparations for the centenary of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, which was due in 1908. As we only owe Monroe's letters, my talk concludes with my efforts to discover what Sadler's thoughts on Prince Hall Freemasonry were, beyond his good feelings towards Monroe. Throughout this talk, I'll be quoting from the letters and other contemporary sources, which use language in relation to race that, although common at the time, are not acceptable today. But first, let's meet our two main protagonists, Henry Sadler and Frederick Monroe. Henry Sadler had been the Grand Tyler of the United Grand Lodge of England since 1879, a paid position with some ceremonial duties. It also involved looking after Freemasons Hall, where he lived with his wife and 6 children. At 15, the Essex-born Sadler had run away to sea for a career in the Merchant Navy. It was as an able seaman that he was initiated into Freemasonry in the Lodge of Justice, Deptford, in 1862. He joined the staff of the United Grand Lodge 3 years later and moved into the hall. One of his duties was looking after Grand Lodge's library and reading room, where he developed a love of Masonic history. His job also allowed him to explore all parts of the building, which led to him discovering the hitherto lost archives of the earlier Grand Lodges of England. By 1887, the title of Sub-Librarian had been added to his job description, and he joined the correspondence circle of Quattro Conati Lodge, a London-based lodge whose purpose was researching and publishing Masonic history. 1887 also saw the publication of Sadler's first book, Masonic Facts and Fictions, a groundbreaking study of the origins of the ancient Grand Lodge based on their archives that he discovered. Frederick Monroe was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1855. He began his working life as a clerk, but taught himself stenography, which is a sort of shorthand using a machine, at the age of 20, and secured employment with the Pearpoint Manufacturing Company, which is now America's oldest glassmaker, as a stenographer and typewriter. He was a parishioner of the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, New Bedford, and was a member of 2 early Black civil rights movements. On the 17th of December 1903, on behalf of one of them, the Union League of New Bedford, he wrote a less than complimentary letter to the Southern black educator, Booker T. Washington, suggesting that Washington should be doing more to encourage the state education of young African Americans. And in 1904, he joined William Du Bois' Niagara movement, which was a forerunner of the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. He had become a Freemason in 1895, when he was initiated in New Bedford's Union Lodge. In 1899, he was elected its master and was appointed the corresponding Grand Secretary of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. It was in this capacity that he first became known to Henry Sadler. When Sadler wrote to Monroe in 1901, possibly about some publications, he may have been influenced by William Upton of the Grand Lodge of Washington in America's Northwest. The previous year, Upton wrote a paper for the Transactions of Cotracarnati Lodge, called Prince Hall's Letter Book, in which he described Frederick Monroe as the best informed and accurate of New England Masons. In 1898, Upton, a lawyer, district judge, and a man ahead of his time, persuaded his Grand Lodge to recognise that all Prince Hall Grand Lodges that could trace their origins back to African Lodge were part of a legitimate mainstream Freemasonry. They also decreed that race and colour were no bar to Freemasonry, and that the Grand Lodge had no right to stop its individual lodges welcoming Prince Hall Freemasons. Pleased with their decision, the members elected Upton their Grand Master for the following year. It was then that the backlash started. The Grand Lodges of Washington's decision caused an outcry among the majority of other American Grand Lodges, notably those in southern states, some of whom had rules forbidding black or mixed race candidates. Neighbouring Grand Lodges threatened to de-recognise the Grand Lodge of Washington and stop its members visiting their lodges. Recognition and visitation rights are important issues in Freemasonry, especially in the United States, where there's no national Grand Lodge. Much to Upton's dismay, the Grand Lodge of Washington reversed its decision as soon as his one-year term as master was over. However, not before he published a report in their Grand Lodge proceedings, which was called A Critical Examination of Objections to Legitimacy of the Masonry Existing Among the Negroes of America. In England, G.W. Speth, who was the secretary of Cotracarnati Lodge, called it a marvellous paper and wrote, "Upton judges whether Negroes are real Masons, applying only the fundamental and enduring landmarks of Masonry to the exclusion of American Grand Lodge regulations." And then he added, "For the historian, this is the only correct course." On the 20th of January 1902, Frederick Monroe sent Sadler a copy of this report and informed him that the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts was about to publish a new edition. Just a few months later, on the 19th of May, Monroe sent Sadler the updated report, which was now called Negro Masonry. At 260 pages, it was double the size of the original, with additional appendices and letters. Upton, who was the first Pacific Coast member of Cotracarnati Lodge's correspondence circle, used his connections to garner the opinions of Masonic scholars and Grand Lodges throughout Europe and the United States. To his credit, he published all the replies, even the critical ones. Sadler wrote to thank Monroe, to which he replied on the 14th of July, saying of Upton, "He has given us in his book, which money cannot buy, and that is a genuine sympathy and goodwill, which takes thought for the welfare of others equally with his own. More than this, is willing to do what he can to promote it." Excuse me. On top of thanking Monroe, Sadler's letters also mentioned another author, William Grimshaw, who was researching for a book to be called The Official History of Freemasonry Among the Coloured People of North America. This was due to be published in 1903 by McCoys of New York, who were a large fraternal bookseller and regalia manufacturer. Grimshaw's book is now widely criticised for its hopeless inaccuracies and fictional biography of Prince Hall, but for many years it was treated as the definitive history of African-American Freemasonry. William Grimshaw is an interesting character, with a similar background to Sadler and Monroe. Self-educated, he was a former US Navy cabin steward who later worked as a doorkeeper at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. As a Freemason, he was a member of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia, who endorsed his book, which is why he was able to call it an official history. Grimshaw twice wrote to the Grand Secretary of the United Grand Lodge of England for information. These are his letters, firstly in 1901 and again in 1902. Without Upton or Monro's connections, he mistakenly addressed his first letter to C.F. Matier, the Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Master Masons, instead of Edward Letchworth, the Grand Secretary of the United Grand Lodge of England, who was Henry Sadler's boss. This was an easy error to make. The Mark Masons at the time occupied a building next door to Freemasons Hall, but they made sure that Grimshaw's letter was passed on to the right people. This first letter contained a number of questions about the origins of African Lodge. The follow-up asked if there's any evidence that Prince Hall had been appointed a provincial Grand Master for North America, which was a popular myth about Prince Hall, and for which Grimshaw produced a transcript of a blatantly fake document. Sadler proved why the document was fake, and Letchworth pointed this out to Grimshaw in his reply. He also, on Sadler's recommendation, suggested that Grimshaw should make contact with Monro and Upton. Grimshaw used Sadler's information about the fake document to rewrite the transcript, to which the myth of Prince Hall as an English provincial Grand Master continues to this day. It was this sort of exchange that prompted Sadler to ask Frederick Monro about William Grimshaw. Monro was furious about Grimshaw and his book. In his letter dated the 14th of June, 1902, he told Sadler that Grimshaw was not a librarian at the Library of Congress, despite the headed paper, and Monro had known nothing of Grimshaw's book until the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts had announced their plan to publish Upton's. When Grimshaw had approached him, he was unwilling to help, questioning Grimshaw's methods and complaining that several of his questions were of a nature that no student of Masonry would ask. 1 month later, after some pleasantries following an exchange of photographic portraits, these two in fact, Monro again turned to Grimshaw, writing, "I discouraged him for the reason stated that I thought he had no right to try and exploit his book at the expense of Brother Upton." But then, Monro's Grand Lodge had a lot riding on Upton's book. In 1902, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts was not a large body, with 10 lodges and just over 320 members. Printing 500 bound and 200 unbound copies of Negro Masonry had cost them nearly $600 and delayed the printing of their Grand Lodge proceedings. However, their Grand Master, William Reed, explained the importance of the book to the members at their quarterly meeting in December 1902, saying, "This book was not published with the expectation or aim of financial gain, but simply to place in the hands of all who are honest enough to reason an accurate history of our order." When Frederick Monro was elected Grand Master in 1902, all but 77 unbound copies of Negro Masonry had been sold or given away. I've not been able to discover the print run of Grimshaw's history, but believe it is much larger. Many American public and university libraries still own copies today. McCoy's Masonic Publishing and Supplies were a major business founded by the entrepreneur Robert McCoy in the mid-19th century. It published some extremely popular American Masonic authors, such as Rob Morris on the left, who was a poet and founder of the Order of the Eastern Star, which was and still is a fraternal organization for Freemasons' wives. On the right is the historian Albert Mackey, who created an important and popular Masonic encyclopedia, which remained in print for over 100 years. I should also add that Mackey was a spiteful critic of Prince Hall Freemasonry, and it is somewhat ironic that he shared a publisher with William Grimshaw, whose official history, backed by McCoy's nationwide distribution network, was going to have a much larger print run and potential audience than Upton's. That said, Monro still hoped that Upton's efforts to promote Prince Hall Masonry within white Grand Lodges would one day bear fruit. Writing to Sadler in March 1903, he said, "A strong undercurrent of sympathy with them is evident on the part of many white Masons, which will ultimately find expression, in my opinion, along the lines laid down by the Grand Lodge of Washington." That was Upton's Grand Lodge. Monro's letters covered other subjects beside Grimshaw and Upton. On the 19th of August 1902, he mentioned what was then seen as a growing problem by Prince Hall Grand Lodges, the emergence of independent African-American lodges, which Monroe called bogus masonry. He explained how the Grand Secretary of the predominantly white Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, Serrano Nickerson, that's him in the picture, used the existence of these bogus lodges to attack all Black Freemasonry. Brother N, he told Sadler, has a strong dislike to Brother Upton, and his prejudice against the masonry of coloured men is a mania with him, and he's never hesitated to malign or misrepresent it on all occasions. But, he added, we survive, and we have some good friends in the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. In a letter dated the 14th of August 1903, he expressed his concerns about the situation facing African Americans in southern states, writing, the South has been in the saddle for many years, and the same South is largely, though not wholly, responsible for the policy which prescribes us. And the indications point to the unseating of the South. This was sent in the same year he was elected Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, which actually lasted for 3 years. On the 25th of August 1904, he thanked Sadler for a letter of congratulations, and in turn congratulated Sadler for a pay rise, writing that he envied Sadler's access to the Grand Lodge Library. A letter sent on the 15th of November 1904 mentioned a German Freemason called Karl Wiebe, who was writing a book about the Grand Lodge of Hamburg, to which Monroe planned to subscribe. Wiebe was actually the master of the Grand Master, in fact, of the Grand Lodge of Hamburg, and along with many liberal German Freemasons at the turn of the century, was supportive of Prince Hall Freemasonry. He'd written letters of encouragement to Upton in 1899. His Grand Lodge formally recognised the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, and in 1903, Wiebe commissioned a medal celebrating Monroe's election as Grand Master. Sadler also subscribed to the book, which was published in 1905, and regularly corresponded with Wiebe and other German Freemasons in search of both Masonic literature and objects for the museum. There were no Monroe letters for 1905 and 1906, so I assume that Monroe was now busy during his final 2 years as Grand Master. On the 5th of February 1907, Monroe wrote to thank Sadler for some Grand Lodge proceedings and professed relief that his period as Grand Master was finally over. The letter also contained 2 important news items. He officially invited Sadler to the centenary celebrations of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, which was happening in 1908, and with sadness reported the death of William Upton, which had occurred on the 6th of November 1906. I suspect that Sadler had been mixed feelings about his invite. He would have been honoured that Monroe invited him, but he would have been unable to attend. Apart from the cost of the trip, he'd have got into serious trouble attending an event for a Grand Lodge that his employer, the United Grand Lodge of England, did not recognise as legitimate Freemasonry. A note in the top left-hand corner of the invite just says, declined 10/4/07. Sorry about the picture, this time it's a bit faded. Monroe only wrote once more in April 1907. He understood that Sadler could not attend the centenary, writing, it would have been very pleasant if the conditions permitted you to be with us at that time. But if this is not to be, it is gratifying to have your good wishes. I've no idea why the correspondence ended at this point, although Monroe would have been extremely busy as corresponding Grand Secretary in his Grand Lodge's centenary celebrations. His letter writing skills were put to good use in May 1908, when he wrote to the famous educator Booker T. Washington again, this time asking him to step down as the guest speaker at the centenary celebrations because of local opposition, which may well have been Monroe himself. He was, after all, a follower of William Dubois, who was often critical of a less radical Washington, although interestingly, both Washington and Dubois were Prince Hall Freemasons. As the 20th century progressed, Prince Hall lodges and the Masonic halls played an important supporting role in the civil rights movement. Frederick Monroe remained an active and dedicated Prince Hall Freemason until his death in 1926. Henry Sadler, seen here playing billiards in Freemasons Hall, retired as Grand Tyler in 1910 and was immediately appointed Grand Lodge Librarian. He was elected Master of Quatre Coronati Lodge in 1911, but unfortunately died before the end of his year in office. Freemason friends paid for his headstone, which was designed by the artist Thomas Sterling Lee. Years ago, I presented a conference paper on these letters and later published an article on them for the Philaxis Society, which is a Prince Hall research organisation. At the time, I was disappointed that we only had access to Monroe's letters because Sadler did not keep a letter book, and it appears that the Prince Hall Grand Lodge in Massachusetts did not have the originals. I was intrigued to find out Sadler's personal views on Prince Hall Freemasonry. Over the years, some clues have emerged. The first was another letter in our collection, dated the 1st of November 1901. It was from the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Virginia, and it recounted a visit to London by their Grand Master, Robert Jones, and Grand Secretary, Dr. Harrison Harris, pictured on the left. Harris was a medic from Richmond, Virginia, who in 1902 published Harris's Masonic textbook, a manual for Prince Hall Freemasons. The letter writer takes up the story of their visit. And while in that city of London, they recorded the freedom of your building and were allowed to inspect your very valuable library and to obtain from the office of your Grand Secretary much valuable historical information touching the question of the introduction of Masonry into our country from your Mother Grand Lodge. It turned out that their guide that day, who they thought was the Assistant Grand Secretary, was in fact Henry Sadler. I thought that would be it. But then a couple of years ago, the Scottish Rite Masonic Museum and Library in Lexington, Massachusetts, purchased a collection of correspondence addressed to Jacob Norton in Boston. Norton was a Jewish Freemason from England who emigrated to Massachusetts in the late 19th century. He joined a Boston lodge, but soon resigned because he thought the American rituals were far too Christian and made him feel uncomfortable. He never lost his interest in Freemasonry, instead corresponding with Masonic scholars around the world, including Sadler, and publishing articles in Masonic newspapers and periodicals. He was often in disagreement with contemporary Masonic opinion and was friends with local Prince Hall Freemasons. My Lexington colleagues, librarian Jeff Cotreau and archivist John Colo, drew my attention to this Henry Sadler letter to Norton from 1891. In response to Norton's request for spare copies of historical pamphlets from the library to pass on to a Prince Hall Freemason, Sadler wrote, "By all means, give it to the coloured brother that you name, but you need not say it came from me, for if the GS, by that he means Grand Secretary, knew I'd given them anything, he might not like it. We're supposed to look upon them now as an irregular body or something very like it, but for my part, I think they are quite as regular as the whites." Thank you for attending the talk. I'm happy to say that things have changed a lot since Monroe and Sadler's days, with Prince Hall Freemasonry now recognised in most Grand Lodges in the United States and around the world, including the United Grand Lodge of England. I'd also like to say there's some really good historians of Prince Hall Freemasonry out there, like Alton Roundtree and John B. Williams of Philaxis Society, and Oscar Lane in New York. And John Dickey's latest book, The Craft, has two really excellent chapters on Prince Hall Freemasonry, one about the Victorian period and later one about the 1950s. Thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was really great. Do you want to stop sharing screen so we can see you? Thank you so much. Bravo. By the way, that was really good. Let me do that on behalf of everyone. If you have a question for Martin, please do post it in the chat and we will try to get through as many as we can. Blimey, that was some interesting letters, Martin. I was wondering if we could just start with Frederick Monroe a little bit, because he's a very, very interesting man. Do we know anything more about his background and his life? What have you come across there?
Well, obviously he was as with a lot of African American Freemasons of the period, he was a sort of self-made man. He taught himself skills to get work, and he used Prince Hall Freemasonry to better himself. I suspect he became their corresponding Grand Secretary because of his skills with the typewriter and as a stenographer. He was a man who could compose letters, but I know that he taught himself German. So when he corresponded with Karl Wiebe, he was actually corresponding in German. Sadler, when he corresponded with Karl Wiebe, corresponded in English.
That is amazing.
And obviously he joined these various organisations. So the Union League was an early African American rights organisations. In fact, it was to encourage African Americans to register to vote and vote Republican, because in those days the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln, who were considered the sort of more liberal party in the United States. Where in the early 1900s, the Democrats were definitely the Southern Party, who were bringing in Jim Crow laws, and so there was that. The Union League was a big push to that, and then the Niagara movement was a more of a political civil rights organisation. So he obviously had that interest, and the fact that he criticised Washington was a Southern African American, and his goal was to encourage African Americans to get educated and live the most productive life they can, in the hope that their white Southern neighbours would recognise them as and give them equal rights. Whereas Zubar was much, well, we don't have to ask them permission. We should be demanding equal rights. So I guess that's the difference between, because Monroe lived in Massachusetts, which was a northern state, and Washington was in a southern state. It was a different way of having to try and get your rights.
Yes, true, very true. That says a lot. Martin, there is an interesting aspect in you mentioned this exchange of portraits as well, and Monroe being the first to post a photo in, I think you mentioned 1902 to Sadler.
Yeah.
Now, was this a normal thing?
I think it was, because you want to see who you're corresponding with.
Yeah.
And it seems that the picture of Harrison Harris, that was also sent to Sadler with the letter. And I think it's that way of getting to know someone more. I should have mentioned it, but in one of the letters, Monroe goes to describe what he thinks about Sadler's picture. He talks about him looking wise or friendly. And he talks about his own appearance, saying, "I'm quite short," and I don't. Not that you can tell from a picture while he's sitting down, but isn't it? They're both very dapper, which is quite nice. But I suspect Sadler's correspondence, he would have said something similar about Monroe. They seem to be very polite all the time in their corresponding.
And I guess we can also conclude that there was a developing friendship there, in that kind of thing. Martin, there is a question here for you in the chat. I'll just read it out. I want to make sure I get everything right here. Do the Prince Hall Grand Lodge hold ceremonies in the UK, as I have attended at the US Navy barracks? Are they still active?
I'm not sure now, because they were active where there were, the Prince Hall is quite popular amongst American Freemasons serving in the US. In fact, nearly all the Prince Hall Freemasons I know at one point were in the American military. And they had lodges, along with other American Grand Lodges, had lodges that were attached to Air Force or Army Air Force bases. So whether there still are bases, I don't know. So they all may be back in the States now.
Very good. Another one for you in the chat, Martin. Is there one book on Prince Hall Masonry you would recommend?
Oh, there's a really good book by Alton Rowntree and another guy whose name I can't remember. It's gloss. I'll post it on the.
It will come to you.
Yeah, I'll post it on the YouTube version of the thing. I mean, there's all sorts of books on Prince Hall Freemasons. John Williams, who I mentioned at the end of the talk, he's recently written. It's only just been published, and I haven't got a copy yet. Although I wrote the foreword to it. He's just written a book called The Prince Hall Story Revisited. And it's basically looking at Grimshaw's book and all the misinformation and bad history that's in it. Grimshaw was a terrible historian, an interesting man, but he tended to, if he didn't know something, he'd make it up. And sometimes he printed things that he knew were incorrect. So the classic case is when Sadler told him that this supposed transcript he had of a document was wrong and why it was wrong. Grimshaw used Sadler's facts to alter the document to make it look more authentic, and then still published it. And yeah, and it's done Prince Hall Freemason a massive disservice, Grimshaw. So you still see a lot of things that appear in his book being quoted in various sites and on Wikipedia and things. And John Williams has done a really good effort of debunking some of these myths and getting the story straight. In fact, the Philaxis Society, which is Prince Hall's research body, their main mission was originally to try and put away the mistakes from Grimshaw's books. Very
good. Martin, I have, this is a bit of a long one for you in the chat, so I'm just going to read it out so I don't miss anything. Dear Martin, congratulations for an excellent talk. Did you find any correspondence between the two GL of Mars, White and Prince Hall, at the time of Monroe? The mainstream GL of Mars made an attempt of recognizing Prince Hall in 1947, but also stepped back as GL of Washington in 1898.
Yeah, there wasn't any correspondence in our collection relating to that. I have read about it in books on Prince Hall Freemasonry, including the Alton Roundtree one, whose name I can't remember. But no, it's interesting when the United Grand Lodge of England finally got round to recognising Prince Hall Freemasonry, which was in the 1990s, it was actually the Grand Lodge of Washington, sorry, the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, the predominantly white Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, who instigated this. They asked the United Grand Lodge of England to recognise Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, which sort of opened the door then to all the other Prince Hall Grand Lodges around the states being recognised by the predominantly white counterpart, and then being recognised nationally. So Massachusetts, although Serrano Nickerson's one of the bad guys in my talk because he was quite an anti-Prince Hall fan, it seemed the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts was one of the Grand Lodges that eventually became one of the good guys. But then Prince Hall Freemasonry was found in Massachusetts. It's found in Boston.
Martin, another interesting character, there, Upton, you mentioned. Did you come across anything interesting in your research about him?
Yeah, Upton was really fascinating. I don't want to go too down the white sort of saviour route, but he had this. I mean, he'd met Prince Hall Masons and wanted them to be able to visit his lodges in his area. And he was obviously completely devastated when his Grand Lodge reversed a decision that was like really monumental because the hostile reaction of all the other Grand Lodges. And when he died, he actually had, it was in his will that he would be buried without a headstone until the Prince Hall Freemasons were recognised. And so it was like almost 100 years later that a headstone was put on his grave, and it was a ceremony held by the Grand Lodge of Washington and the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Washington together. So yeah, interesting man.
Very, very. Martin, this just popped up in the chat as well. Did the first Prince Hall Lodge receive a warrant from London?
Yeah. So what happened was there was a group of black men in Boston during the Revolutionary period in America, and they'd been initiated into Freemasonry by some Irish Freemasons. And after the Revolution, they wanted to form their own lodge, and they really wanted to be part of the Grand Lodge of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, which had recently been set up. So there had been English Freemasonry in Massachusetts, but after the War of Independence, the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts was established by local Freemasons, like people like Paul Revere in it, but they wouldn't allow the African Americans to join their lodges. So they wrote to England and asked for a warrant, and the English knew that they were African Americans. I think John Morant, who was a preacher, was in England. He was one of the, and they got a warrant from the Grand Lodge of England. And there are a lot of correspondence from Prince Hall to the Grand Lodge of England in our collection, and they last for the sort of about the first 10 years of the history of African Lodge, and then they sort of peter out. And in 1813, Grand Lodge takes off all the American lodges from its list of lodges, because it just assumes that all the American lodges have now joined their own independent Grand Lodges. But there's a sort of smattering of letters from Prince Hall lodges ever since, but the bulk of them were in that really early period when African Lodge was set up and it wasn't a Grand Lodge.
Very good. Martin, time is running, but I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned also the Booker T. Washington letter correspondences there.
Yeah.
Are these published? Can we find out more?
Yeah, they are. In fact, that was when I did my initial research, and I just had an inkling that Monroe might be one of these people who wrote to lots of people. And so I just tried to find sites to put things he might have written to. And I can't remember which American academic institution it is. And again, I can put it in the notes on the YouTube channel. But the Booker T. Washington correspondence, they were published in a book, but there is an electronic version of this book. So I was able to find exactly what he'd said. And so, yeah. They have been published.
Martin, here towards the end, where can people go and find out more about Monroe and about Prince Hall?
Our library is a very good place to start when we're open. Also, the Phylaxis Society's website's a good starting point as well. It's Let's see if I can remember how to spell this. It's PHYX. Yeah, oh no, I can't. I'm hopeless at spelling. My dyslexia kicks in. Actually, there are other books on Prince Hall Freemasonry as well. Which there's a French academic called Cécile Revigier. She wrote a book about Black Freemasonry. Again, we've got a copy of that in the library.
She's here with us tonight, Martin.
Oh, is she? Well, hello, Cécile.
She is indeed. That's very good. Thank you, Martin. I'm afraid we are running out of time. Apologies if we didn't manage to get all your questions in. But I want to say a huge thank you to Martin for a fantastic talk, and thanks to Louise for technical support. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us and for your questions. We hope you will consider joining us for another live webinar, because we will be back on Tuesday, the 11th of May at 7:30 p.m. British time, with our curator, Mark Dennis, for a talk about John, the first Duke of Montagu. So please join us. It will be very interesting indeed. The link to register is already available on our website. So for now, thank you so much for joining us and enjoy your evening.
Thank you.